I was in the daycare parking lot signing my name on the pickup sheet when my phone buzzed and my husband sent a text that knocked the air out of my lungs. I emptied everything. Mom says you hid your $80,000 anyway. Noah is better off without this drama. Good luck paying rent. My pen stopped in the middle of the letter W in low. The clipboard suddenly felt heavy in my hand. Behind the glass door, kids were laughing and running in circles while the automatic door slid open and shut. The world looked completely normal while mine tilted. I stared at the screen hoping I had misread. Another message arrived before I could breathe. Mom finally opened my eyes. You have been sitting on your dad's $80,000 while I break my back. I am done being used. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I opened the banking app with clumsy fingers. Joint checking, $17. Joint savings, $0. A bright red banner reminded me that our rent, $1,350, was due in 4 days, and a late notice had already gone out. For a second, everything went quiet. No kids, no door, no rain on the windshield behind me, just the sound of my own breath. Then the daycare door opened and my son Noah barreled out with his backpack sliding off one shoulder and a piece of paper clutched in his paint-stained hand. "Mommy, look what I made." I pasted on a smile that did not belong to how I felt. "Hey, buddy, let me see." On the paper, he had drawn 4 stick figures me with curly hair, him in a bright blue shirt, Jake with a baseball cap, and his grandmother Marlene with red lipstick, all standing in front of a big green field and a little brown house. He'd even drawn a tiny sun on the edge of the field. He pointed proudly. "That is Grandma's farm. She says it belongs to our family." The word farm made something cold slide down my spine. I buckled him into his booster seat, my hands shaking so much I fumbled the buckle twice. "Are we getting pizza tonight?" he asked. "Daddy said if he got paid, we could." "Daddy is busy right now," I said, choosing each word like it might explode. "We will see what we can do at home." On the drive back through Des Moines gray afternoon traffic, my phone buzzed again this time with a voicemail notification. I hit play on the car speaker, and Marlene's voice filled the small space crisp and satisfied. I told Jake the truth, she said. "Everybody knows about your little $80,000 now. Maybe next time you will not try to steal a man and a legacy with it." My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my fingers hurt. She sounded like someone who had won a game she had been secretly playing for years. I ended the message before it finished staring ahead at the red brake lights in front of me. I did not call her back. I did not call Jake. I did not cry. They think the only thing my father left me is a number in a bank, I thought. They have no idea. I could hear his voice in my memory telling me when he set up that account. "This is for you, when you are older, not for impressing anyone, and definitely not for anyone you marry." I had kept that promise like it was sacred. Now they were turning it into a weapon. When we pulled into the parking lot of our small apartment building on the south side, Noah was humming to himself, kicking the back of my seat. I carried his backpack in one hand and my empty stomach in the other. At the mailbox, a stack of envelopes waited with my name printed in sharp black letters. One from the electric company, one from the gas company, one from our landlord. I tore open the landlord's letter right there in the dim hallway light. "One more late payment, and we will have to reconsider your lease." The words swam for a moment. Upstairs, Noah dumped his crayons on the kitchen table and started coloring a new sun over a new field while I stood at the counter, phone face-up banking app still open, like proof of a bad dream. I was trying to figure out which bill could wait and how many extra shifts I could pick up at the store when my phone rang again. The caller ID showed a last name from Jake's side of the family, a cousin who rarely called me directly. I answered and tried to steady my voice. "Hey, this is Aaron." There was a pause then, a cautious, almost accusing tone. "So Marlene says you stole $80,000 from Jake. Is that why you never help with their farm back in Story County?" For a second, I could see the gossip spreading, reaching from their living room to church pews and social media comments, people nodding along as if they knew my life. The mention of the farm of land they loved to talk about, but did not own the way they thought they did, made my jaw tighten. I looked over at Noah, bent over his drawing tongue between his teeth, absolutely certain that his family was solid. When I spoke, my voice came out cooler than I felt. If she is talking that loud, it is because she is scared of something I said. She should be. I remember the year 2018 with a kind of soft clarity. The edges of everything slightly blurred like the way late autumn light hangs over Des Moines, and I can still see myself at 27 working mornings as an assistant in the public library where the air always smelled faintly of old paper and coffee from the volunteer station, then rushing to Hy-Vee in the afternoons for my cashier shift, letting the beep of groceries fill the quiet moments I did not know were shaping me into someone careful, someone observant, someone who listened more than she spoke. That was the year I met Jake, 30 years old, working construction, and siding with a confidence that made him look steadier than he actually was. And he came into the library one rainy Thursday to pick up a book on home repairs, smiling as if he already knew I would notice the tiny paint splatter on his boots. He bought me a coffee a week later, insisting on paying, even though mine was just a $3 latte, and he told me he was good with money that he was saving up to buy land someday, maybe a few acres outside town, somewhere quiet where life could be built with calloused hands and clean intentions. And I let myself believe it, because back then, hope was not something I questioned. He said he liked that I was smart with numbers, that I could read a bank statement, like it was a short story that my friends trusted me to explain interest rates and late fees and why their credit card bills kept climbing. And I smiled because it felt good to be seen for something other than being responsible. My father had died of heart failure when I was 24, and grief lived in the corners of every room for months, thick and heavy. Yet he had left behind a safety net tucked inside a thin white envelope, a CD account with $80,000 from the leftover life insurance, and something even more precious, a partial ownership stake in a 40 to 60 acre stretch of farmland in Story County that he and my grandfather had held for decades, a quiet place where corn rose in summer and the soil smelled rich and deep after rain. Only my mother and I knew the truth about it, that the land had been legally assigned to me. Not Jake, not anyone who would later lay claim to it. And my mother, Diane, had warned me gently but firmly to keep it that way, saying, "This is for you when you are older, not for impressing anyone, and it is definitely not for anyone you marry." We kept the papers in a thick manila envelope tucked in the locked drawer of her bedroom cabinet, and I kept a scanned copy on a small silver USB drive that never left my purse because something in me understood that even the safest things can be stolen when the wrong eyes find them. When Jake and I married in early 2019, he began mentioning to his mother, Marlene, that my father had left me something, smiling like it was a harmless detail. Though every time he said it, I felt a small tightening in my chest, as if something delicate had been exposed to cold air. Whenever Marlene asked me directly, I kept it vague, saying it was in my mother's name for now, and that I did not touch it, hoping the lack of detail would be enough to make her lose interest. It never worked. She would tilt her head like she was studying a flaw and say, "Must be nice to marry with a cushion. Some of us built everything from scratch," making sure her voice carried far enough for the cousins at the table to hear and look at me with that mix of curiosity and judgment that sticks long after the moment ends. Jake never corrected her, never stepped in to say that her comments were unnecessary, and I realized later that he liked being seen as the one who had worked harder, the one carrying weight, even though the truth of our finances would not have supported that story. I chose silence because keeping the peace felt easier than unraveling every petty jab, and I told myself that protecting the farmland and the CD was more important than correcting their misconceptions. I never told anyone beyond my mother that the farmland was still producing income through the tenant farmer, who leased it a small but steady amount that we left untouched because it was part of my father's legacy, something sacred. something meant to be handled with reverence. Most people only knew the rumor of $80,000 whispered with a mixture of envy and resentment. And Jake let that rumor grow because it made him look generous whenever he paid for dinner or bought something small for the apartment as if he were lifting us, despite the mythical cushion I supposedly refused to use. The first time I understood how deep Marlene's suspicion ran was after my father's funeral in 2020, when she arrived at my mother's house with a casserole and the overly bright sympathy that always felt more like reconnaissance than comfort, and she offered to help organize papers because she knew grief could make a mess out of simple things. My mother led her into the study for a while, thinking nothing of it, but after Marlene left, she noticed the bottom drawer slightly misaligned. The one she kept locked the one she never opened while guests were in the house, and she sensed, in that instant, that someone had pulled it open and rifled through the folders stacked inside. She panicked until she remembered that the night before, acting on nothing but instinct, I had taken the manila envelope out of the drawer and placed it in a bank lockbox in town, not telling anyone because it felt like the kind of move that only works if it stays secret. My mother called me in a trembling voice to tell me what she had found, and I told her not to worry, that the papers were safe, that Marlene had gotten nothing but dust and a few outdated utility bills. I felt a chill when she said, "Thank God you moved them," as if something in our bloodline had warned us to act before the storm gathered. Now, when I think about that week, I understand it was the first sign, the seed of injustice settling into the soil, the moment I learned that some people will dig through the remnants of your grief if they believe there is money buried under it. And I also know this is the part of the story Jake still does not know, that I moved my father's papers long before he or his mother ever thought to look. The summer of 2021 still sits heavy in my memory, the thick Iowa heat pressing against my skin as I carried little Noah across Marlene's backyard, where folding tables sagged under paper plates and crock pots, and where every laugh felt a little too sharp, a little too curious. And I remember how my hands were greasy from turning ribs on the grill, because Jake had disappeared to talk to his cousins, leaving me to juggle Noah on one hip while trying not to drop the serving tongs, and I kept telling myself to breathe, to smile, to keep the peace the way I always did. Marlene stood near the patio, waving her guests in with a confidence that made her look 10 feet tall, and she liked positioning herself where everyone could hear her, liked pretending she was the gracious hostess who kept the whole family spinning. And when enough people had gathered, she looked at Jake with exaggerated pride before turning her eyes on me as if she had been waiting for a cue. "Jake works so hard," she said loudly in that proud mother tone that always carried an undercurrent of accusation. "Construction is not easy, and he breaks his back to provide, but Erin is careful with money. Her daddy left her something, you know." The words cut the air like a blade, and I felt the whole table shift as heads turned toward me. Forks paused. Mid-air conversation stopped, eyes flicking across my face like they were searching for guilt, and a distant uncle who had barely spoken to me all year leaned forward and asked with blunt curiosity, "So you got what, 50 grand 60? Marlene let out a laugh that was meant to sound playful, but it had the sharpness of someone snapping a twig just to hear it break closer to 80 from what I heard, and she looked at me with a smile that dared me to contradict her. Heat rose up my neck, and I swallowed hard, whispering that it was not like that it was my mother's retirement cushion, hoping the softness in my voice would keep the moment from escalating. But Marlene pounced on it with a louder voice, meant to gather attention. "Sure, honey, that is why you let my son pay rent while you sit on your little farm money," she said with a sweetness that almost hid the venom, and that single word farm slammed into me. Because it was the first time I had heard it spoken publicly, the first time I realized the rumor had leaked further than I thought. A cousin blinked and asked, "Wait, she has land too," and suddenly I felt stripped bare, under the soft glow of backyard string lights, every secret my father trusted me with hanging by a thread. Yet I could not explain anything without betraying the promise I made to my mother, so I stood there with Noah shifting in my arms, my throat tight, my face burning as if someone had dragged me into the center of a spotlight. The humiliation did not wash off with the day because at church, the following Sunday, Marlene carried the story with her like a prized ornament, telling the women's group that she was praying for Jake's family because his wife refused to help with the inheritance her father left, and by the time the service ended, half the congregation had heard their version of events. An older woman touched my arm gently and said if my husband had left me that kind of money, I would not let my kids struggle her tone kind, but edged with judgment, and I felt myself being pinned into a narrative. I did not choose the selfish wife hoarding money, while her hard-working husband provided the outsider who would never quite belong. The worst part came after the service, when we all went to the small diner near the church for our usual group lunch, and Marlene insisted on ordering extra sides for the table, extra desserts for the kids, telling the waiter to put it all on my card, because she is the rich one and she can cover it, saying it loud enough for the surrounding tables to glance over. My stomach twisted because I knew exactly how much was in my account, and it was not enough for that bill. And when the waiter ran my card and it declined in front of everyone, the air went still for a moment, full of the quiet shock that lands harder than shouting, and I wished I could disappear under the booth. Jake muttered something like, "You should keep better track of your spending," while he slid his own card across the table, and I saw two church ladies whisper behind their menus, their pity landing on me like a bruise. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Noah was asleep, I walked past the small room Marlene used as her temporary office. Whenever she stayed over and the door had been left slightly open, the desk lamp still glowing. Something tugged at me to look, and when I stepped closer, I saw a faintly blurred photocopy of the CD account papers. My father left the ones that mentioned $80,000 sitting beneath a printed description of the Story County farmland, and I felt my breath catch in my chest because it meant someone had rummaged, copied, hunted for what was never theirs. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and snapped a photo of the documents on her desk, the grainy texture of the photocopy proving someone had taken a picture or had access to the originals at some point, and I backed out of the room quietly, my steps careful, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I did not confront her. Not then, not with how small I felt after the weekend, but I stored that picture like a seed planted in dark soil, something silent that would grow into truth later. I crawled into bed beside Noah and stared at the ceiling for a long time, understanding for the first time that humiliation could come, layered public-private, whispered, shouted, and every version of it carried its own sting, and even then, beneath all that shame, I felt a faint hum of something colder, older, something that reminded me that I had moved my father's real papers long before anyone tried to touch them, and if they wanted a war over legacy, they had no idea what story they had stepped into. By early 2022, the air in our small apartment felt different, heavier somehow, as if the humiliation from the previous year had settled into the walls and learned to echo back at me every time I tried to breathe, and returning to work as an inventory assistant at the large supermarket on the east side of Des Moines gave me a routine that dulled the ache even if the pay barely covered groceries, but at least the hours were predictable, and I could drop Noah at daycare before the morning shift. Jake announced that he was starting his own construction business, saying it with a pride that made it sound bigger than it was, even though most weeks he only picked up small siding jobs from friends or neighbors. Income that came in, bursts, sometimes, nothing for days, sometimes a few $100s that disappeared as fast as it arrived, and he kept telling me that once it took off, we would not have to worry about money again. Marlene grew bolder about inserting herself into everything financial, telling me to send her every bill we received each month so she could help organize them for Jake, and even though it felt intrusive, I went along with it because fighting her always led to more tension than I could handle. She would pick up each receipt like she was searching for evidence of sin, making comments about every tiny thing, pointing at the grapes I bought for Noah's lunches, and saying, "Must be nice. Since when I was your age, we only ate what we canned," making me feel extravagant for choosing fresh fruit in a country where grocery aisles were lined with it. I kept my voice quiet because keeping the peace felt safer than snapping. But deep inside, something was shifting, and I started writing down every bill and every transfer in a small spiral notebook I picked up for 99 cents at the store. Telling myself it was simply for my own tracking, though in truth, it was the first quiet boundary I built against them. The cruelty of everyday moments came in sharp flickers, the kind that leave bruises you cannot show anyone, like the day Marlene deliberately chose my checkout lane at the supermarket, even though 3 shorter lines stood open, pushing a cart overflowing with expensive snack packs and specialty items, smiling as she placed each thing on the belt. When the total flashed on the screen, she spoke loudly enough for the cashier at the next lane to turn her head, saying, "My daughter-in-law has money from her daddy's farm. She can afford it. Go ahead and put this on her card, dear." And I felt my stomach tighten, because I knew my card was already near its limit. The moment the machine beeped and declined my card, the silence that followed felt like a spotlight, and Marlene sighed dramatically before looking at Jake, who had wandered over and was now leaning against the end of the belt. He shrugged in a way that suggested this was somehow my fault, saying, "I told you not to spend so much," while the people behind us pretended not to stare. I drove home that day with my hands trembling on the steering wheel, the humiliation clinging to me like static. And when Jake stepped into the shower, I opened my laptop, quietly logging into our bank account to reassure myself that maybe we were not as close to empty as I feared. But instead I saw a series of identical transfers, $150 every week, moving from our joint checking into an account labeled as Low Family Trust Savings. My breath tightened as I scrolled, seeing weeks and weeks of these transfers already gone, money disappearing in the background while I stretched my paychecks like thin fabric, trying not to tear. When I confronted Jake gently, he waved my concern away, telling me not to overthink it, saying it was for Noah, that his mother had set up something smart for our future, insisting that families who plan early end up stronger, and he made it sound irrational for me to question anything. Marlene chimed in later with her usual sweetness that tasted like vinegar, saying, "If you would share that 80,000, we would not have to do it this way," returning to that mythical number like it was a crime I had committed against her son. Their words were meant to shame me into surrendering what they believed belonged to them by marriage and entitlement, and every time they said it, I felt the grip of my father's memory strengthen around me, as if reminding me that legacy is not something to be negotiated through guilt. One afternoon, when my shift ended early because a delivery truck was delayed, I decided to take the long way home, driving through the quiet streets near the river, where the bank branches sat tucked between insurance offices and a small bakery. And as I approached the intersection, I recognized Jake's old pickup in the parking lot of a bank I had never seen him use. Something pricked at the back of my mind, and I slowed down, pulling into the side lot where the windows of the car next to me were tinted enough to hide me if someone glanced over. Minutes later, I saw Jake and Marlene step out of the building, both holding a thick folder with the bank logo stamped on the front, and they were smiling the kind of smile people wear when they feel victorious about something no one else knows. My pulse thudded as I ducked lower, watching them talk enthusiastically before walking toward the truck, and I held my phone just high enough to snap a picture of the glass door where a gold plaque read, "Family Trust Services." A cold understanding slid through me, heavier than fear, something ancient inside whispering that they were not simply hiding money. They were building something around it, shaping a system that excluded me while using the very income my labor had supported. I sat in the car a long moment after they drove away, staring at the picture, feeling the weight of every small humiliation that had led me to this point. And for the first time, I understood that this was not just petty behavior or boundary pushing. It was strategy. And I knew in that instant that if they were building a structure, I would have to find a way to dismantle it piece by piece before it swallowed everything my father had entrusted to me. By the beginning of 2023, the pressure in our lives tightened like a slow-moving storm that never quite broke open. the kind that hangs low over Iowa skies and makes you feel as if the air itself is warning you, and every bill that slid through our mail slot felt heavier than the last because gas prices climbed, the electric company raised their rates again, and the landlord left a notice taped to our door about rent increasing due to market adjustments, and I remember standing there in the hallway with Noah tugging at my sleeve while I calculated how many extra shifts I would need just to keep us breathing. I took on 2 evening cashier shifts at the supermarket, dragging myself back under the fluorescent lights after Noah's bedtime, whispering a goodnight promise into his hair before Diane picked him up for the evenings. Jake claimed he was too tired or too busy to watch him, and even though I felt myself stretching thin, Jake acted as if my schedule inconvenienced him, complaining that he barely saw his wife anymore, and saying it in a tone meant to sound wounded rather than accountable, all while refusing to keep steady work or follow up on the contracts he bragged about. Marlene began offering what she liked to call solutions sitting at our small kitchen table with a cup of her decaf coffee, while she explained that my mother Diane was wasting away in that little house in Story County, saying it would be better for everyone if she sold it and moved into assisted living near us, because then we could use the freed cash to stop stressing about rent, and she spoke as if she was suggesting something kind, even though every word felt like a shove toward a cliff. I told her that the house and that land were the only pieces of my father my mother had left, that selling them would be like erasing him. But Marlene only raised her eyebrows and said, "Since you are sitting on 80,000 from the same man, I am not sure how much memory you need." A sentence that made my chest feel hollow because it twisted grief into accusation. One afternoon, I arrived early to pick up Noah from Marlene's house, and as I stepped through the back door, I heard her voice in the kitchen, low and purposeful, speaking to someone on the phone, and I stopped just outside the doorway, long enough to hear her say, "If we can convince Diane to sign, there is at least $250,000 tied up between the land and the house, and Jake deserves his share too, since he married into that." And I felt the air leave my lungs, because in that moment I understood that their plan reached far beyond me. The number 250,000 sat in my head like a warning siren, bright and sharp, and I could almost see them mapping out how to convert my mother's home into their financial cushion, their entitlement growing roots into soil that never belonged to them. I held Noah closer that evening, trying to hide the tremor in my breath as I buckled him into his car seat, telling myself I needed to think clearly, that I could not let anger push me into rash decisions, because the only way to survive people like Marlene was to stay 2 steps ahead. A week later, Marlene embarrassed herself without realizing it when she bragged to the church women's group that I refused to help the family, despite inheriting money, spinning herself into the sympathetic martyr while painting me as selfish, and I kept quiet through the luncheon even as my hands shook under the table. But later that night, I opened my email and attached a screenshot of our checking account, balances, my pay stubs, and the list of bills I covered every month, sending it to the church group with a simple note saying, "Just to clarify, these are the actual balances of our accounts and what my paycheck covers every month, and please keep us in your prayers." The message did not attack. Anyone did not mention Marlene, did not even hint at resentment, but the truth sat plainly in black and white, and by the next Sunday I could see how the group had split, some of the women offering me kind smiles, others glancing at Marlene with uncertain eyes as if they suddenly recognized the gap between her stories and the facts. She was quieter that day, not fully humbled but definitely unsettled, and the shift felt like a small victory, a gentle pushback that reminded me I was not powerless even if I still felt trapped. When the weekend came, I drove to Story County to visit my mother, craving her steadiness the way people crave warmth after standing too long in the cold, and as soon as I stepped into her kitchen, she studied my face with the intuition only mothers have. We talked over tea, the quiet kind of conversation where every word feels safe. And when I told her what Marlene had said, what I overheard, what they were planning, she grew still in a way that told me she had been expecting something like this long before I realized it. She walked to the drawer near the sink and returned with a small silver key, pressing it into my palm with fingers that trembled just slightly, and she told me it was the key to the safe deposit box in town where she kept the original documents, the farm deed, the CD account paperwork, everything that mattered, and she said, if they are circling like vultures, then you better be the one holding the lock. The metal of the key felt cool and heavier than something so small should, and I slipped it into my pocket with the slow understanding that I was stepping into a different chapter of my life, one where silence was no longer protection, but a weapon they counted on me not to use. The days after Jake emptied our accounts felt like walking through a long, narrow tunnel, with no air left inside, the kind where sound barely travels, and every step echoes back at you as if reminding you how alone you are, and returning to the present after everything that had built up in the past years made the blow feel even sharper, because now the consequences were no longer hidden behind whispers or rumors. They were in my bank app, in my mailbox, in the tired, pleading in Noah's voice. Our joint account sat at 0, the numbers flat and unforgiving on the screen, and beside it the savings account showed the same nothingness, a hollow space where our security should have been, and it felt like someone had reached into my chest and scooped out something vital. On the kitchen counter, the rent notice lay curled at the edges, warning that payment was overdue, and late fees were piling, and layered on top of it was the voicemail from Marlene that made my stomach twist. Her voice smug and crisp as she said she hoped I enjoyed the mess I created since I refused to share what she kept calling my inheritance. Jake followed it with a text that landed like a slap saying, "Mom talked to a lawyer, and you will have to explain that 80,000 good luck, proving you are not unstable with your little anxiety history." The words twisting something tender inside me, because he knew exactly how to aim them. Knew the months I struggled after Noah was born, the therapy sessions, the slow climb, back to myself, and he used it like a blade. I sat there staring at the screen until the letters began to blur, feeling as if the walls of the apartment had shifted inward, closing the distance between me and every threat they had gathered. Then the phone rang again. This time the landlord, whose voice was usually warm, but now carried a strange, cautious tone, as he said a woman from church, a friend of Marlene's, had stopped by the property office asking about availability and had mentioned she might want to rent our unit in case we moved closer to my mother-in-law. And he said it in a way that let me know he suspected something, but did not understand the whole picture. And I could hear the implication beneath it that Marlene was already positioning someone to slide into our home the moment she pushed me out. The sense of being cornered wrapped around me like thick smoke money disappearing rent, late the electric bill threatening shut-off daycare fees due, and the unspoken threat of custody if they insisted on spinning my anxiety into a weapon. And I tried to take steady breaths, but my body felt too small for everything pressing against it. That evening, while I packed Noah's lunch, he tugged at my sweater and asked in a small, quiet voice if we would have to sleep in Grandma's basement, if Daddy took the apartment, and the innocence in his eyes broke something deep in me, because children do not create these storms, yet they always end up standing in the coldest part of them, and I crouched down and held him close, telling him no, even though I had no idea how to make that promise true. I stepped into my bedroom and called my mother, needing her steadiness, the way drowning people need a hand above the water, and when she answered, I could hear dishes clinking softly in the background, the familiarity of home settling around her voice. I told her everything, the drained accounts, the threats, the landlord's call, the fear that no matter what I did, they were already writing a story where I was the villain. And she listened with the quiet patience she always had, then said, "The CD is untouched, and nobody can take a cent without my signature. If Jake thinks he took everything, he is dumber than I thought. But honey, you cannot keep letting them turn your father's gift into a weapon." Her words washed over me like warm water, grounding me, reminding me that what my father left behind was never meant to be twisted into guilt or held over my head by people who only saw dollar signs where memories lived. When I hung up the phone, I stood for a moment in the dim room, letting the truth settle in my bones, understanding that I had spent too long shrinking myself to avoid their anger, too long explaining, apologizing, trying to make peace where none was ever offered, and something in me finally snapped into clarity. "I am done explaining," I whispered into the quiet. "I am going to fight." And I felt the weight of those words anchor me in a way nothing else had. That was the moment the shift happened, not loud or dramatic, but unmistakable. The point where I stopped thinking like someone trying to survive their chaos and started thinking like someone preparing to dismantle it. Later that night, while Noah slept, I pulled the silver key from my drawer, the one my mother had given me, running my thumb along the ridges, and the memory of the safe deposit box surfaced so sharply it felt like someone had spoken it aloud. I remembered the envelope inside the original deed to the farmland, the CD paperwork, and then a smaller document I had almost forgotten, a folded page my father added near the end of his life, one I had skimmed but never fully absorbed because grief had blurred everything then. Now the words returned to me with startling clarity, a small clause allowing me to place a lien on any property obtained or secured by misuse of his insurance documents or identity, a protection he added after hearing stories of families torn apart by greed, something he tucked into his affairs quietly, as if he knew someone might someday try to weaponize his name. I stood there in the darkness, holding the edge of the key and understanding that this was more than inheritance, more than paperwork. It was a shield my father had built for me long before I knew I would need it, and the realization settled into my chest like a spark, catching flame, silent but ready to burn when the time came. I woke the next morning with the decision settling in my chest like solid stone, the kind you do not pick up lightly and definitely do not put down once you have chosen to carry it. And after dropping Noah at daycare, I drove across town to a different church, one that stood quiet at the corner of a residential street, with a small sign announcing the legal aid clinic in the basement, a place people rarely talked about unless they had nowhere else to turn. Walking down the narrow stairs felt strangely fitting, as though I was descending into the part of my life where truth finally met consequence. And when I pushed open the heavy door, the hum of old fluorescent lights flickered overhead, while a woman in her early 50s looked up from a metal desk stacked with folders. She introduced herself as Melissa Grant, in a calm, steady voice, her eyes sharp in a way that made me understand she had seen every kind of financial betrayal there was. And when she gestured for me to sit, I felt something in me unclench, maybe because she carried herself like someone who had survived the same type of war I was just beginning. I laid everything out for her, my voice trembling at first, then growing more certain as I unfolded bank statements, the auto transfers into the so-called family trust screenshots from the BBQ where Marlene had laughed about my supposed inheritance, Facebook posts twisting the story until I looked like the selfish wife who hoarded money, while her husband broke his back working construction, and then the truth about the $80,000 the farmland in Story County, the safe deposit box, the little clause in my father's addendum that had hovered at the edge of my memory like a shadow, waiting to be recognized. Melissa listened without interrupting, nodding slowly as she took notes, then leaned back with an expression that made my stomach tighten, because she saw the shape of something I had sensed, but had been too scared to define. She said Marlene and Jake had not only manipulated the story, but had likely committed financial misconduct by implying the $80,000 was marital property, using joint account funds to create the Lowe family trust under the guise of helping a child, and possibly using information from my father's estate to open accounts they had no right to open, and hearing it in words made the whole architecture of their plan slot into place like a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Melissa leaned forward and told me the first steps were simple but urgent: transfer. My paycheck into an account in my name only removed Jake from payroll access at the supermarket before he rerouted anything else and began filing for an emergency custody and financial hearing to freeze whatever they were building under the trust. Each instruction felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, the pieces I had handed over too easily, because I thought peace meant surrender. And when she pushed a form toward me with a pen, I signed it without hesitating, the small act of writing my name becoming a quiet declaration of battle. With the papers tucked in my bag, I drove to the supermarket's HR office and requested to change my direct deposit, the clerk typing away with no idea she was helping reroute my life, and afterward I sat in my car feeling the first breath of control I had felt in months, faint but real. Then came the part of me that still simmered with everything I had endured, the small, sharp place that wanted justice to taste just a little bitter on its way down for the people who had humiliated me so openly, and the opportunity arrived almost too easily. At the Women's Fellowship Room in Marlene's church, the same place she loved holding court, while exaggerating my supposed inheritance, there was a bulletin board used for volunteer sign-ups and prayer notes, and I knew most people passed it without looking closely unless something unexpected drew their eye. So I printed a simple one-page summary of our monthly finances. No names, no accusations, just plain numbers, income versus bills, daycare fees, 3 weeks overdue grocery totals I had covered alone, and at the bottom a single quiet line that said, "When someone tells you I am sitting on $80,000, ask them why my son's daycare bill was 3 weeks late," and then I pinned it discreetly at the corner of the board before walking out. I did not stay to watch the reactions, but later heard the murmurs through a mutual acquaintance, the way women paused in front of the paper. The hush stronger than any scolding. The kind of silence that erodes reputations far quicker than gossip, because it forces people to sit with the inconsistencies, and Marlene must have felt the shift because she stopped posting about me for a few days, retreating just enough that I knew the small revenge had landed exactly where I wanted. When I returned to the clinic later that week, Melissa asked to see the addendum from my father, the little document I had kept folded for years, and as she read it, a slow smile formed, not cheerful, but triumphant, in the way someone looks when they uncover a hidden lever that can move an entire wall. She explained that if we could prove Marlene or Jake had used or referenced my father's insurance or estate documents to legitimize the trust or any financial claims which the photocopies on her desk strongly suggested, then I had the right to request a lien on any property obtained or backed by that misuse, including the biggest asset in Marlene's life, her fully paid-off house in Des Moines. Hearing those words made the air feel electric, because this was the part no one in the Lowe family knew, existed the part they could not prepare for. And I realized the secret I carried was not just a set of documents, but a trap door. None of them had noticed a legal weight strong enough to shift the ground under their feet. And as I walked out of the clinic that day, I felt something steady growing inside me, not anger and not fear, but certainty. The certainty that the people who thought they had stripped me down to nothing were about to learn how wrong they were, and that my father's final gift, the one they mocked and twisted, would become the very tool that unraveled everything they had built on lies. I left the clinic with Melissa's plan printed in my mind like a map I had finally earned the right to read, and the next week she arranged for me to meet a forensic accountant named Mr. Alvarez, a retired man in his late 60s who worked from a tidy converted sunroom attached to his garage, the kind of space filled with old file cabinets and neatly labeled folders. And when he shook my hand, his grip was firm, but his eyes carried the tired recognition of someone who had spent decades cleaning up the wreckage of other people's secrets. He asked for every statement I had, every screenshot and every note from the calendar, where I had logged the afternoons Jake and Marlene slipped off to the bank. And while he flipped through the pages, he made small comments under his breath about patterns and timings, and the way money always leaves a trail even when people think they are being clever. We sat together for hours that first day, cross-checking auto transfers, matching each suspicious date to a withdrawal or a meeting, and he occasionally paused to ask if I remembered anything unusual about a certain Friday or a certain grocery run, and each question nudged another memory out of hiding. When he finished the first pass, he looked at me and said he wanted to visit the bank branch himself, not to file anything official yet, but to verify a couple of internal notes that his experience told him must exist. And when we went together later that week, the bank officer who greeted us was a woman around the same age as Melissa, her hair clipped back neatly, her expression shifting subtly when Mr. Alvarez introduced himself and explained we were reviewing irregular activity connected to the Lowe family trust. She asked us to step into her tiny office off to the side, closing the door quietly, before speaking in a low voice, and what she told us made my stomach turn, because she said that some months back, Marlene and Jake had come in together with a crumpled photocopy of what they called the original documentation for an $80,000 certificate, saying they wanted to open a matching CD in their names to consolidate family assets, and the request had been denied because they could not produce proper authorization or legal tie to the original policy. She said there had been an internal note flagged by a bank manager that mentioned possible misuse of documents belonging to a deceased policyholder, and hearing that phrase spoken out loud hit me with a cold rush because my father's memory was wrapped up in every one of those papers, and now I knew with certainty they had not just speculated or joked, but had tried to appropriate his legacy in a way that was both illegal and deeply personal. I walked out of the bank with a tremor in my hands that slowly hardened into something steadier, something closer to resolve, because each revelation gave me a clearer portrait of the people I had tried too long to understand, people who smiled at Sunday service while secretly rehearsing the steps to steal from the daughter of the man they pretended to mourn. The next week gave me a chance at a small revenge I had not planned but embraced with a quiet burn, because Marlene came into the supermarket one afternoon pushing a cart filled with imported snacks, organic cheese, and a bouquet of flowers, and she steered deliberately toward my register as if she expected me to wilt the way I once did under her scrutiny. She chatted loudly about her church committee while unloading the cart, tossing in little comments about family responsibility, in that pointed way she liked to perform, and when she slid her debit card from the joint account through the reader, the machine beeped, once then displayed the screen. I already knew it would show because Jake had emptied the account down to nothing. A line began forming behind her, people shifting impatiently, and she frowned at the screen, then looked at me as if I might fix it for her. But I kept my voice polite and clear as I said, "The account appears to have no available funds. Would you like to use your personal card instead?" And the sentence carried across the entire lane, because the store was unusually quiet just then. Marlene's face flushed a deep red, her mouth opening and closing as she stammered something about a mistake at the bank. Then she began removing items from the pile, mumbling that she did not need them, and the people in line watched her with the same mixture of sympathy and amusement she had often inspired in them toward me. I did not smile and I did not gloat, but I felt the private relief of a balance restored, for just a moment the soft shift of humiliation falling on the person who had handed it to me so many times before. When I told Melissa and Mr. Alvarez what had happened, they did not comment on the pettiness of it, only on how even small public interruptions of control can reveal the truth faster than any confrontation. And then we returned to the real work as Mr. Alvarez compiled a full timeline of the trust activity across 18 months. He highlighted a total of $10,000 pulled from our joint account into the Lowe family trust, each transfer disguised as savings for Noah. And then he pointed to a particular entry that made me grip the edge of the table, because the date matched the exact week I had told Marlene we were struggling to pay the electric bill during a cold snap. And instead of offering help, she transferred $3,000 into her personal account the very next morning. Seeing the numbers on the page, the precise alignment of my hardship and her self-enrichment brought me to a quiet stillness, because it was not just cruelty or gossip anymore. It was theft, executed with a smile, and the realization settled into me like the final piece of a story I needed to see clearly. Mr. Alvarez printed the report and handed it to Melissa with an approving nod, saying the pattern was undeniable. And as I left their offices that afternoon, the wind cutting across the parking lot felt sharper, but somehow cleaner, as if the air itself understood that the truth had finally taken shape and would no longer be ignored. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived with a sky the color of cold tin, the kind of Iowa morning that feels heavier than it should, and as I walked up the steps of the Polk County Courthouse, with Melissa beside me, I felt the strange mixture of fear and clarity that comes when you know the place you are entering will change the direction of your life no matter what happens inside. The hallway outside the courtroom carried the usual echo of footsteps and the low murmur of other families dealing with their own private disasters. But my breath caught when I saw Jake and Marlene standing with their attorney, a neatly dressed man who looked irritated to even be present, and both of them carried an air of confidence so thick it felt rehearsed, as if they had spent the entire week convincing themselves that the story they had built would be enough to bury the truth. When the clerk called our case, they strode in ahead of us, Jake with his arms crossed, Marlene with that familiar tight smile she saved for moments when she thought victory was already hers. And once we were seated, their attorney began with the polished tone of someone laying down accusations he had only half bothered to verify. He claimed I was emotionally unstable, waving vaguely at my old anxiety history as though it were a weapon, and said I refused to contribute my supposed $80,000 from my father, painting me as selfish and withholding, then added that I kept Noah from Jake out of spite, twisting the nights I had cried alone into a narrative designed to humiliate me. I waited hands clasped while Melissa let them empty everything they had rehearsed, her expression unreadable. And when the attorney finally stopped talking, she rose slowly, placing a neat stack of folders on the table with the kind of deliberate calm that made the judge lift his eyes with interest. She began with the joint account statements, the ones showing the balance before and after the night. Jake sent the message asking where the $80,000 was, revealing, in stark numbers, the sudden zeroing out of funds, then handed forward the report from Mr. Alvarez detailing the pattern of transfers into the Lowe Family Trust. Each entry aligned with dates I had been humiliated or pressured about money, and the judge's eyebrows tightened when he reached the line about the $3,000 transferred into Marlene's personal account the morning after I had told her our electric bill was overdue. Melissa did not stop there. She presented the internal banknote documenting the attempt to open a matching CD using a photocopy of my father's old documents, calling it by its name possible misuse of a deceased policyholder's information. And Jake shifted in his seat, while Marlene stared straight ahead, her jaw locked. Then Melissa lifted the small addendum from my father's will, the one granting me authority over any asset tied to his insurance paperwork, and she clarified that the only people with legal claim to the $80,000 were my mother, Diane, and me. Not Jake, not Marlene, not the trust they had created. For the first time, the courtroom grew entirely silent. But the true exposure came next, because Melissa had printed several of Marlene's Facebook posts where she accused me of stealing family legacy and sitting on $80,000 while Jake broke his back at work. And when she read those words aloud, the judge's gaze hardened his attention, sharpening on Marlene, as if the sound of her own spite had finally betrayed her more clearly than any financial document could. Melissa followed by reading an email reply from the old bank confirming the CD remained untouched under Diane's name, with me as beneficiary. No withdrawals, no attempted claims, and absolutely no authorization granted to Marlene at any time. The judge turned to her, his expression stern as he asked why she told the community at church that I was hoarding money, why she repeated the figure $80,000 as though it were fact, and what she meant by calling it legacy stolen from her son. Marlene stammered about misunderstanding about something she thought she heard at the bank about concern for her son's financial stability. But the judge cut her off and asked why she had brought a photocopy of estate documents she did not own to a financial institution, and her mouth opened then closed again with no answer. That made sense. Melissa delivered the next blow by presenting a printed email from my mother, showing that Marlene had suggested selling my childhood home and the farmland in Story County to help Jake with his debts, even while siphoning money into the trust she controlled, and the judge read the page for a long moment before saying, in a low, measured tone, that the entire pattern resembled financial manipulation toward both me and my mother. Jake pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering something to his attorney, but the courtroom had already shifted, and for the first time I felt the weight of truth landing not on me, but on the people who had built their accusations, like a wall they assumed no one would look behind. Then came the judge's ruling, and his voice carried the firm authority of someone who had reached a clear conclusion. He granted me temporary sole custody of Noah, stating that the financial instability and manipulation demonstrated by Jake and his mother posed concerns about decision-making and household security, and he limited Jake's visitation to supervised hours until a full review could be completed. Marlene inhaled sharply, her face blanching, and the judge addressed her directly, announcing that an elder financial exploitation review would be opened regarding her handling of the shared account she held with her elderly aunt, citing a pattern of behavior that suggested potential misuse, and she gripped the table as though the floor beneath her had begun to shift. Finally, he looked at both of them and said if any part of the father's estate had been misrepresented or used as leverage in financial arrangements, then under Iowa law I had grounds to place a lien on Marlene's primary residence, and he suggested she obtain legal counsel immediately. The words echoed in the room, the quiet finality of consequence settling on their shoulders, and as I stood to leave, I felt no triumph, only a steady return of the dignity they had tried for years to take from me. A dignity that had finally been recognized in a place where truth was not something they could twist or perform, but something laid bare for all to see. The months after the hearing moved with a strange mixture of quiet recovery and loud consequence, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but rolls outward like ripples from a stone dropped into deep water, and each ripple seemed to land somewhere in the world Jake and Marlene had built on stories that finally collapsed under their own weight. The court ordered the Lowe Family Trust to return nearly $10,000 to me as restitution, a number that looked small on paper compared to the stress it had caused, but felt enormous when it hit my new personal account because it was the first time in years money flowed toward me instead of being siphoned away. And Melissa explained that the ruling set a precedent for further review if more irregularities surfaced. Jake was ordered to begin paying back child support immediately, even though his income was inconsistent, and when the judge reminded him that responsibility did not disappear simply because he was embarrassed or broke, he looked down at the floor like a man hearing the truth, too late to be useful. For Marlene, the fallout arrived faster and harsher, because word traveled quickly through the church once the hearing became public record, and within weeks, she was quietly removed from her role as treasurer after concerns were raised about the trust and the attempt to open a fake certificate, and though they never confronted her loudly, she felt the coldness of being excluded from committees she once dominated, the kind of social freeze that happens when people decide someone is no longer safe to stand beside. The bank where she had her home equity line of credit started re-examining her paperwork after Melissa filed notice of my potential lien. And because the HELOC was tied to her remodeled kitchen, a project she bragged about endlessly, the scrutiny angered her enough that she called Jake in tears, blaming me for everything, as if the numbers had not revealed themselves long before the court did. Jake faced his own unraveling when one of his potential clients pulled the plug on a contracting job after reading part of the custody ruling online, not wanting the drama connected to his name, and without steady work, he ended up staying in the basement of a friend who had little patience for his late-night phone arguments with his mother. For me, the months carried a different energy, one that blended fear with newfound stability as I used part of the restitution, and some help from Diane to move out of the creaking apartment that still smelled faintly of Jake's cologne and the arguments we never finished, and into a small, bright townhouse near Noah's school, a place with sunlight that fell warm on the carpet in the mornings, and enough quiet that I could finally hear myself think. I was promoted to inventory lead at the supermarket, a position with slightly better pay and actual health insurance, and my supervisor told me she had noticed the change in how I carried myself, the steadiness that comes when someone begins rebuilding the life they lost piece by piece. In the evenings, I attended workshops at the community center for women learning financial self-defense, where older women with soft voices and hard histories talked about the ways money gets used as a leash, and each session felt like opening a window in a room I had lived in too long without light. The true shift came when Diane sat with me one afternoon at her kitchen table in Story County, sliding a set of envelopes toward me with the same gentleness she once used to hand me my school lunch, and inside were the annual rental checks from the farmer leasing our land nearly $18,000 for the year, a number that startled me despite having known the land existed. She explained that the rental income had been steady for years, untouched, allowed to grow quietly, because my father wanted it to become a foundation for my future, not a fund for emergencies, or a prize to wave in front of people who believed money made them powerful. And as I held the check, I understood it was not meant to save me from hardship, but to anchor me to something he had hoped I would realize when I was ready. I placed the check back in the envelope and told Diane I would keep everything exactly as it was, that the land and its income would remain untouched until I knew what I wanted my life to become, because the point was not to prove anything to Jake or Marlene, but to build something that was mine alone. A few weeks later, Melissa sent an update that pulled all the threads together, explaining that based on the will addendum and the bank's internal note, I could legally place a small lien on Marlene's house due to her attempt to use my father's estate documents to legitimize the trust. And while the lien would not take her home, it would prevent her from borrowing against it recklessly or making large transactions without notice to me. I read the message twice, feeling the weight of it settle in a place beneath my ribs, because it was not about revenge or possession. It was about protection, a legal boundary that finally said she would not rebuild her schemes on the backs of the people she claimed to love. When I signed the paperwork authorizing the lien, I felt something inside me untwist, something that had been coiled tight since the day Jake drained the account and left me with nothing but fear. And now the boundaries were no longer invisible, lines they could pretend to ignore, but documented lines they could not cross without consequence. In those months, I learned that justice does not always look like victory or applause. Sometimes it looks like stability, returning quietly like a child sleeping soundly in a new bedroom, painted pale blue, like a woman learning her value was never tied to the lies told about her. And though the consequences continued to echo through the lives of the people who had hurt me, I held on to the knowledge that the biggest strength I carried had nothing to do with money, but everything to do with choosing not to let them shape who I became. That autumn afternoon in 2024 arrived with a softness I had not felt in years, the air warm enough to smell faintly of cut grass, and the sun low enough to cast long golden lines across the walkway where Noah and I were planting marigolds in front of the townhouse, and for the first time since everything collapsed, I felt present in my own life, grounded by the small scrape of soil under my nails and the quiet sound of my son humming to himself as he pressed seeds into the earth. I was kneeling beside him, brushing dirt from my palms, when I sensed, rather than heard, a car pull up to the curb, the engine idling just a little too long, and when I turned, I saw Jake standing on the sidewalk with a slump in his shoulders that made him look older than the man I married, and behind him in the passenger seat sat Marlene, stiff and hesitant, the version of her I used to imagine only in impossible dreams, where her confidence cracked. Jake gave me a small wave as if this were an ordinary visit, and Marlene stayed in the car for a moment before finally stepping out her movements, slower, her expression tight, as though the walk from the car door to my front step required more courage than she wanted me to know. Jake spoke first, his voice careful and softened by exhaustion, saying he needed to talk because the bank was reviewing the home equity line of credit again, and they might not renew it, and the lien was making things complicated, and he asked if I could ease up even a little, because I had the farm and the inheritance, and we were still family. And before I could answer, Marlene cut in with a tremble in her voice that sounded like humility, but felt like desperation, saying I had already won, and that everyone knew my side now, and she insisted that my father would not have wanted them homeless, and she said it with a wounded sincerity that would have pierced me years ago, but now only landed on the surface like rain on glass. I stood, slowly wiped my hands on my jeans, and told them they could sit on the porch if they wanted to talk, but they would not be coming inside because the house I built from the wreckage of their choices was not a stage for another performance. They obeyed, sitting on the porch chairs I bought secondhand, and I went inside briefly to gather what I had already prepared, without admitting it to myself, the printed copies of the trust documents they created, without my knowledge, the bank statements showing the transfers they executed, the church group status. Marlene posted about my supposed greed, the court order from the custody hearing, and the addendum from my father's will that protected me long before I knew I needed protection. I placed the stack on the small table between us, arranged neatly, and not with hostility, but with clarity. And when Jake reached toward the papers as if they might tell a story different from the one he lived, I gently moved his hand away because this moment was not a debate. I told them in a voice that surprised even me with its steadiness that everything in front of them represented choices they made, not choices forced on them, and that the lien would stay, because it was now part of the boundary they taught me to build, and that the farm and the $80,000 remained exactly where my father intended, untouched and reserved for me and Noah. Marlene tried a new angle, her eyes glassy, as she said she was only trying to protect her son. And I felt a wave of old pain rise, but I let it pass, as I answered that using my father's death and my anxiety to manipulate our finances was not protection. It was harm dressed up in the language of sacrifice, and I watched her flinch, not from cruelty, but from recognition. Jake leaned forward, then almost pleading, asking if I could loan him $10,000 from the farm rent so he could restart his business, promising he would pay it back, promising he just needed a chance. I reminded him with the same calm I used with Noah, when he was frightened, that he had already taken my chance, when he emptied our accounts the week the daycare bill was due, and the answer was no, and it would remain no, no matter how many new proposals he brought to my doorstep. It was at that moment Noah peeked through the doorway holding a tiny shovel in his hand, and I refused to let him witness his father or grandmother in a moment of humiliation. So I smiled gently and told him these were his daddy and grandma, and they were just leaving, and he nodded in that trusting way children do, before running back toward his plants. There was quiet after that, the kind that fills the space between endings and acceptance, and when Jake stood, he did not argue, and when Marlene rose, she looked at me with a mixture of regret and resentment that told me she understood her grip on our lives was gone. They walked back to their car without another word, and 2 weeks later, as I drove through their neighborhood on the way to a grocery store across town, I saw a small for sale sign planted near the corner of their lawn, the sign slightly tilted as if the ground itself had shifted beneath it, and though I felt no triumph, I felt closure, the kind that appears when consequences finally settle in the right places. In the months that followed, I used part of the farm rent and its accumulated interest, not the principal, and not the $80,000, to open an education fund for Noah, a quiet promise to his future that required no applause and no explanation. And I sent a modest donation to the legal aid clinic where Melissa had first listened to me without judgment, a symbolic loop closing itself around the belief that women help women survive what others try to bury. On the last evening before winter, I sat at my new kitchen table with its warm light and clean surface, opened my journal, and wrote the truth I had carried through every dark moment that my husband believed leaving us broke would destroy me, that his mother believed shouting about the 80,000 would drown out her own actions. But my father had left me something far more powerful than money. He left me a foundation I could stand on when the people closest to me tried to take everything else. And to the reader watching my story unfold tonight, I would say softly that if you have ever been called greedy or ungrateful or unreasonable for protecting what is yours, you are welcome to share your journey in the comments. And if you want more stories of women reclaiming their strength in quiet ways, you can stay with me and subscribe, because no one who watches this alone is truly alone.